Welcome, friends. I want to let you know before we begin that we will move through the pace of this service with intentionality, and we will not rush it. So this is probably not a service that will be done in under an hour. This thing we do at the end of someone's life is especially meaningful for those closest to them. It is an opportunity to, held in community, say some of their goodbyes. And so with that in mind, we will take the time it takes to be in this space together, to bear witness to this dear one, and to do exactly what the family would like to do. We do have nursery care available, so if you are a toddler or a baby or a little person and you need to move a bit, or if someone needs to nurse, know that that space is available up the stairs and to the right. Welcome to First Congregational and this celebration of the life of Gregory Wynne Christianson. Okay, Greg. It was a little more serious than I would have expected, but all right. Earlier, we returned Greg's body into the arms of God who holds all creation. We returned his body to the elements of this good earth, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. In community, we continue that act of return as we surround the family and together commit his spirit to God. Let us be aware of God's Spirit with us and within us, in heaven and on earth. From love we came, in love we live and move and have our being, and to love we each return. Let us come before God in quiet. Source of all love, the oneness of all things, our refuge and our strength, our very present help in times of trouble. We gathered here are still. Dear ones, you are still. After a long and hard journey. What has happened has happened. What has not happened has not happened. So let it be. In this time of quiet, let the quietness of peace come upon you. For you, our beloved Greg, whom we love. For you, there are no more troubles and no more sorrows. You have laid your burden down. May God enfold you in peace. Holy One, for Rose and Carl and Scott, for their partners and children, for Gary and Wayne and Linda, who have done the work that love has asked of them. They who have watched and waited and helped Greg on his way. God, will you strengthen them and bear them? Wipe every tear, still every anxiety. May Spirit gently unclasp their fingers, so they may let go into the mystery before them. God, anoint old wounds and mend in your mercy. May our hearts brim with gratitude at the gift of life. Dear ones, as you leave this place and tread the path without map or sign, may you know God's presence with you in grief's dark veil, just as you will know Greg's presence there with you as well. May you remember that love has been this way before. And when the sun that you thought would never come rises over the faraway hill, may you look back and find your heart opened with kindness, renewed by grace, and may you glimpse the light that always shines beyond the places we can see. Amen.
My work is loving the world. Here the sunflowers, there the hummingbird, equal seekers of sweetness. Here the quickening yeast, there the blue plums. Here the clam deep in the speckled sand. Are my boots old? Is my coat torn? Am I no longer young and still not half perfect? Let me keep my mind on what matters, which is my work, which is mostly standing still and learning to be astonished. The Phoebe, the delphinium, the sheep in the pasture, and the pasture, which is mostly rejoicing since all the ingredients are here, which is gratitude to be given a mind and a heart and these body clothes, a mouth with which to give shouts of joy to the moth and the wren, to the sleepy dug-up clam, telling them all, over and over, how it is that we live forever. Love, too, would set a feast before you on a table covered with a spotless cloth, set in a quiet garden where no sound but singing and a softly joyous whispering is ever heard. This is a feast that honors your holy relationship, and at which everyone is welcomed as an honored guest. And in a holy instant, grace is said by everyone together as they join in gentleness before the table of communion. And I will join you there, as long ago I promised, and promise still. For in your new relationship am I made welcome, and where I am made welcome, there I am.
Good afternoon. Today I have the honor and privilege of sharing some stories and reflections from others and myself of this well-loved man, Greg Christianson. I hope you will continue to share your stories with us when you have a moment to do so, if you didn't get yours included on some of the comments today. Karen Jones sent in a poem I'd like to read to you right now. Greg and Rose, your dinners in your home, how you all joined hands around your table, prayed at grace in an unbroken circle of your love. Gathered round this table, beloved people, Greg is here, a laughing spirit among us. He is up off Vancouver Isle too, wild lands and waters on every side, and air clear as wine. After that, and as he goes round, after that salmon, one more time. Here, he's here in our circle, the circle that holds us, the circle that grows ever more perfect in our love. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Karen. Kim also, Karen's husband, sent in something. Greg was a scoutmaster of Boy Scout Troop 1 from 1996 to 1998. He was active in Scouts for years before and after. He led, taught, befriended, and mentored middle and high school boys in life skills such as leadership, teamwork, citizenship, outdoor proficiency. Greg was committed to helping the boys mature into responsible and capable young men. Scouts engaged in weekly meetings, courts of honor, camporees, summer camps, hikes, 50-mile backpack trips, winter camps, skiing, and crabbing in Yaquina Bay, among many other activities. During some of the scouting trips, Greg also demonstrated a few of life's subtle but important pleasures. These activities are not found in the Scout Handbook, though. For example, skiing shirtless in February on a Sunday day in the Cascades, swimming in the Pacific Ocean off the beach of the Olympic National Park. And be sure and take some photos of your scouts standing right behind an extremely seasoned and extremely ripe-scented beached whale. Now, when you do this, you've got to take long minutes to get your photo composed just right, while the scout's eyes are watering and they're keeling over because of the putrid smell. During the 50-mile backpack trip along the Pacific Coast Trail, take frequent breaks and swim in every beckoning lake with Scout and church-approved swimwear, of course. Finally, take your dog everywhere. Greg was a charismatic scoutmaster, and his positive leadership and example to the boys will always be remembered by the Scouts and their families. Greg Fitzpatrick and Joy Kaiser contributed also, and Greg and Greg were Scout buddies also. I can imagine how much fun Kim, Greg, and Greg had. Greg Fitzpatrick reminisced over many of the same scouting adventures that Kim did too, and settled in on specific memories of the 50-mile backpack trip in the Olympic Peninsula. One thing I remember about that trip was that Greg would often go swimming in the ocean. In case you didn't know, the ocean on the West Coast is very cold. I guess Greg loved swimming so much. He was able to ignore the freezing temperature. And we know Greg loved swimming. Another memory I have of Greg was going out in his boat near Newport with the Boy Scouts crabbing. This was so typical of Greg, where he would take the time and the effort to make his boat available so the Boy Scouts could experience an adventure of being in a boat on the ocean. Crabbing from a boat is much more advantageous than crabbing from the shore. And because of this, they were able to bring in extra crab for the boys. And Joy got to benefit from this also. From Linda and Jeff, these folks were friends in adventure and at home. We first met Greg over blueprints in the year 2000. We had hired an architect to help with rebuilding our kitchen, and our friend Kim Jones suggested some contractor named Greg Christianson. Greg looked over the blueprints and our avocado green kitchen and shook his head and let forth a strong expletive, "Oh boy." As the remodel progressed and there was inevitable crises, at each juncture, Greg would shake his head and preface his opinion too with, "Oh boy." Greg started as our contractor, but became a close friend, and along with the rest of his extended family. We had the privilege of sharing many camping, fishing, and hunting trips with him. We learned a number of Christian camping idiosyncrasies also. Brace yourself. Well, for example, other people may tell stories and sing songs while gathered around the campfire. Not the Christianson clan. They like to floss their teeth. Oh boy. Over the years, we spent time together, and there were many opportunities for Greg to utter, "Oh boy," when we lost a very expensive fishing weight while out with Scott and Lauren. When, for some small, still unknown reason, Greg decided the best way to land a large salmon was to throw his rod and reel overboard into the depths of the Pacific. When we were racing through airports to make innumerable connections for our riverboat trip into the Amazon, and when Greg saw Amazon crocodiles and pink river dolphins up close and personal. Like everyone who knew him, we have trouble believing that such a strong, vibrant individual isn't with us anymore. We will carry our strong memories of Greg and all our wonderful times together wherever we go. And when the chips are down and we are faced with a difficult situation, we will doubtlessly be thinking, "Oh boy." Ann Hawkins graciously contributed. I remember Greg and Rose being extremely attentive to politics. The night of the 2008 election, John and I held an open house party to Election Watch. While others were visiting and eating, I remember seeing Greg and Rose intently watching what was happening on the TV. Greg lived out his discipleship through his political choices. And his discipleship showed up thoroughly in his role as an employer. He treated employees well, and before it became somewhat fashionable, he paid living wages and provided health insurance. What a concept. Another memory, Greg and Rose had been in church just about 1 year before our church went through a crisis of faith. After a long search, the church voted on whether to call an open lesbian as our associate minister, and this was in 1987. The vote was split, and the call didn't happen. Greg knew I was terribly disappointed. It was not an easy time for me to be in this employ of the church. And Greg took time to come to the office one day and tell me how sorry he was and that he knew how difficult that experience was for me. Obviously, I have never forgotten his kindness. This from a man who was not afraid to acknowledge his feelings. And finally, I've said to John, Ann's husband, many times, if I had a younger brother, I would have wanted him to be Greg. Greg was an excellent human being and most especially an excellent man. And because of Greg and Rose, we have two more excellent men role models in Carl and Scott. We need so many more Gregs in this world. He was one in a million. In my memory, and I wear this in honor of Greg, because he was a part of the choir. Of the many hats that Greg juggled on his head, and he had many of them, the one that I saw him wear the most was that of a member of our church and our choir. Along with being involved with committees and being our go-to contractor, being a calming presence wherever he was, Greg also held the long-honored status, along with other menfolk, of angelic choir boy. He was a member of the back row basses. We had reserved spot for Greg next to me on my left ear, and it was always wonderful to see Greg and Rose and Wally on Sunday mornings. As most knew, Greg had a comforting presence. He spoke softly, but you knew he carried a big stick, if ever needed. Probably a 2x4. Greg, being humble yet clever, would parley with the best of us. There's a well-kept secret about the back row of the choir. It's mostly men, and we like to yuck it up a bit. Even choir directors succumb to the sirens of silliness when sitting back there. Miles was a hoot. Even Dr. Z has had his moments, though he may say that his antics are for student director training purposes only. Greg, in his quiet way, would seldom initiate a silly pun or a disruptive joke, but many times he had an answer for them. Greg's response would usually be to raise an eyebrow and give an almost subaudible 4 to 5 word volley just to put frosting on the event, followed by a smile. Several times in the years gone by, I recall talking to Greg about our brilliant humor of the day, and at times, within earshot of Rose. I remember more than once getting a raised eyebrow from her and wondering if the threats of separating the troublemakers meant us. A comment always followed with her lovely and forgiving smile. Though we are now in separate spaces, Greg, you will always be with us and one of the back row basses. Humble carpenter, song-filled soul, and friend.
After Rose and Carl asked me last week to speak, I received an email from Rose sharing a couple of memories she had of Greg, and at the end of each story, she typed, "That's just who Greg was." In writing this tribute, I just knew that those words had to be the title and the theme of what I'm about to say. I'm sorry. This is just who Greg was. Many stories will be shared about Greg's love of the earth, his passion for hunting and fishing and traveling, his willingness to contribute to society in many ways, both locally and nationally, his continued quest for knowledge and information, outspoken in his beliefs, and fiercely faithful to each one of them. That's just who Greg was. But my story today is about beauty for ashes. It has been difficult, to say the least, for our family to experience Greg's diagnosis and battle with cancer. But in the midst of my heavy-hearted sadness, through prayer and deep thought, my spirit experienced a gladdening as I realized the living legacy Greg has left us by what he demonstrated in his 64 very full years. Because the legacy Greg left us is very much alive and calling to each one of us. In the process of asking other family members to share a memory that they hold most dear about Greg, a very evident and bold theme began to form, And that theme will become very apparent to you all as I read to you some of the reflections that I received. From Rose. One memory I have of Greg is when I had known him for 8 months. We were living in Missoula, Montana at the time, and we decided to travel back to Cleveland, Ohio to visit my family. My mom and dad had 3 acres, and maybe a half an acre of it was garden. They had a small tractor, which they kept in the garage because they had no other storage for it. Greg heard about this and decided to build a storage unit for them. So he packed up his skill saw and his other tools, and he and Rose traveled back. Solidly built and conveniently located by the garden, my parents were amazed and so happy for their new tractor shelter. Now, needless to say, my boyfriend could do no wrong. I don't think he was trying to impress them, well, maybe just a little. But that's just who Greg was. Another memory of Rose's was when she delivered their first son, Carl, in Alaska. It had been a long labor, and he had been my coach, and we were both very tired when I finally had to have a C-section. When they brought me back to my room and put the baby in the nursery, Greg rolled up his jacket and slept on the floor next to me so he could be there when I woke up, because that's just who Greg was. And from other members of our extended family, from niece Annie, holiday time at Uncle Greg's takes my mind back to standing on the deck, watching Greg and Gary attempt to roast a turkey, always too big for the grill, so therefore dinner was always late making it to the table. But as they stood there trying to cook this turkey, laughing, storytelling, drinking a beer, and playing with all the dogs, and there were many. From niece Molly. Uncle Greg was always one of my biggest champions. He was always supportive, he was always sharing laughter with me, and he was literally always there for me. From Sister Linda. Those frequent and unexpected phone calls to me, just checking in. I always felt so much better hearing his words and his laughter. From nephew Bennett. The memory I hold on to is the effort he always made to spend time with family local or miles away. Whether we were fishing, whether we were crabbing, hunting, camping, or merely sharing a meal or a conversation, Greg was where he wanted to be. From sister-in-law, yours truly, I just have to say that each time goodbyes were exchanged and hugs were passed around after a visit, I would look into Greg's eyes, and his eyes would water up. I loved it, as if to say, I'm really glad you're part of the family. I'll always remember that. From niece-in-law Riley. Greg would attend my basketball games, and every time we visited, he always made an effort to sit down and talk to me about school and life. He attended every event we ever invited him to, including my college graduation party, my basketball games, and Mia's first birthday party. From niece Jenny. Uncle Greg, along with 2 of my other Christianson uncles, have always been a very important part of my life because they were part uncles and part father figures. I always looked for a husband who reminded me of my uncles. Uncle Greg was always so intelligent, so kind, so funny, and could tell a great story. One of my favorite stories was the time when he and Aunt Rose saved a hiker stranded on a cliff. It's just who Greg was. From nephew Russell. Here is one I came up with. Several years ago on a Canada trip, a massive log had floated up to our beach and was perched high up on some rocks. All of the cousins got to work trying to push it off those rocks. We had all sorts of other logs and sticks, bracing it, trying to get some leverage. We couldn't get it to even budge. After a while, Gary and Greg wandered over to see if we were going to kill ourselves. Within a couple minutes, the 2 of them were both balancing on the far end of the log, using their weight to aid in the process. I don't think we ever got that log to move very far, but tons of fun nevertheless. That memory always stands out to me, says Russell. Greg was truly one of the best people I've ever known. Kind, intelligent, active in the community and towards bettering the world. But he also had a great sense of humor, and his inner child always came out at the perfect moments. I love that. From grandson Gail, 4 years old. Last summer, Grandpa Greg and Gail were out exploring in their yard, and they discovered that there were tree frog tadpoles swimming in the black plastic that Greg had put over the garden beds for the winter. Now, of course, Grandpa wanted to make a teachable moment out of their observation, so he and Gail found some containers and caught the tadpoles and then carried them down to the pond to release them. 2 years ago, when Gail was 2, Grandpa bought their new boat. The new boat was in the shop, so consequently he had the old boat in the side yard in the house, getting it ready to sell. Gail always wanted to explore the boat with Grandpa, so he and Dad were in the bow of the boat, investigating the compartments. This is Carl speaking here. Grandpa started to pretend that a piece of scrap cardboard was a fish swimming alongside the boat, and a piece of rope was the fishing line. It was really cute to watch. The game morphed into Gail dangling the rope over the edge to go fishing. I would tie the cardboard on and tug on the line from below the boat so he could catch a fish with Grandpa. Gail remembered when he and Grandpa would sneak cookie dough from the bowl and then deny it when Grandma Rose turned around to catch them. He remembered that was a lot of fun for him. And from Carl, the first thing that comes to my mind is how Dad loved to go fishing, and more than that, he and Gary created a family tradition with the annual Canada trip. As I look back, these are some of the best times I remember as a child and later as an adult. Through our 20s and our early 30s, this was our biggest and best time each year. To have quality time with Dad and all of our family. Without the boats and the adventure of that trip, I'm not sure we would have spent a whole week as a family, all of us together. This time with Dad was more than the fishing for me. It was the camping, it was the adventure, it was the camaraderie, it was the dinners on the beach, it was talking around the campfire, it was traveling. I really cherish those memories of my dad. I remember the first backpacking trip Dad took us on to Square Lake off of Highway 20. I must have been about 10, Scott was about 8. It was late in the evening when we got to the trailhead, and we hiked in a long way, perhaps a mile or so. I think it got dark, so we decided to pitch our tents in the dense forest before we got to that lake. As I recall, we had a campfire. There were a lot of mosquitoes, and we snuggled up against the cold of the mountains in Dad's pup tent, and I think that trip opened up a lot of future adventures for me. And from Gary, a brother. 12 or 15 years ago, Greg, Russell, and I were driving back from Montana from Rainy Lake, where we had been fishing for a week. Russell had been playing really hard with his cousins for the week and spent most of the drive sleeping in the back seat, which gave Greg and I a lot of time to reminisce. We bought a yellow legal pad, and we took notes as we tried to catalog our lives together. It ended up being a 28-page document with a lot of discussion about the chronological order of things. Pretty hard to pull out just a couple favorite memories from that long list, you can imagine. But the overriding theme was that Greg and I both pushed each other to do more, or in other words, if someone else could do something, we could at least do that or maybe even more. It's been a driving force for both of our lives. For example, back when we were kids, we used to watch a TV show called Sea Hunt. Perhaps some of you probably remember that. Our take-home message from that show was that we should learn to scuba dive. Unfortunately, there was an age requirement to get certified. Greg was old enough, but I wasn't. No problem. We pooled our money for the class. Greg got certified. I read his book, and we were both ready to go. So we bought some used ex-Navy equipment from a guy in the want ads, and we started diving. I honestly don't know where Beth and Wally were here at this time. Greg was certified so he could get both tanks filled. Many underwater adventures together ensued. Underwater adventures like diving, gold dredging, lots of snorkeling, ending way too soon, with a couple fantastic dives near the Kona Harbor in Hawaii just 1 year ago. During high school weekend evenings, we would often spend just driving around on the country roads around our hometown in Illinois. One night, a friend of ours and I were driving our Corvair, well, Dad's Corvair. And we found that if we drove up the little ramp going across the railroad at about 30 miles an hour, you could sail completely over the tracks and smoothly land on the downhill ramp with hardly a bump. We tried it a bunch of times. It was just great. So the next night, we couldn't wait to take Greg and show him. Now, Greg was so impressed, he wanted to try it himself. So Greg decided, of course, in his spirit, decided to do us one better. Somebody can do it, I can do it more. And he hit the ramp at 45 miles an hour. We completely flew over the tracks and flew over the down ramp and landed really hard on the flat road. But the car seemed okay, so we just drove home. The next morning, we came out to see Dad, looking at the back of the car. Boys, do you know why the engine mounts are broken? And the engine is just dangling on by the transmission? It was many years later we confessed to Dad what we had done. Or the house that we built. We had done lots of remodeling and parts of new construction, but we never did the entire deal. Didn't faze Greg and me. We studied the plans, worked out the prices, put in a proposal for the job, and we got the job. And in our usual style, we pushed through every obstacle that came up, including a giant ponderosa pine stump that stubbornly would give way to the excavation equipment. We had an explosive permit from our gold dredging days, which is a whole bunch of new stories, and some leftover explosives, so we decided to just blow the trunk up. Oh, now you have pity on Beth and Wally, do you? Yes, it worked, and nobody got hurt by some miracle, and the house we built turned out great, too. But my all-time favorite memories are made every time the Christianson families got together and we started sharing stories, and so many laughs, so many good times to share, and Greg was always a part of the storytelling. I will miss Greg horribly, but I'm going to keep him alive in my memories of all the good times we shared. Yes, Greg loved adventure. He demonstrated courage as a young man, he packed up a truck and he took off from his Midwestern hometown for the West. And through all the miles and all the moves and the many experiences Greg went through, one habit remained. He stayed in touch and connected to family, because that's just who Greg was. So what is the living legacy Greg has passed on to us? I believe he would tell us this. There is so much life out there, so much love to share, so many good people to share it with. Grab those times, share those times, learn from those times. Thank God for those times. Greg, we will strive to carry on the tradition you so faithfully demonstrated, core family values. Because that's just who we want to be too, family strong. So I'd like to end with a poem that was shared with my family at the time of my father's passing. It has been one I've saved and cherished, and I would really like to share it with you. We seem to give Greg back to you, dear God, who gave him first to us. Yet as you did not lose Greg in giving him, we have not lost him by his return. Not as the world gives do you give, God, so you love our very souls. For what you give, you do not take away. Life is eternal, love is immortal, and death is only a horizon, and a horizon is nothing but the limit of our sight.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Mark. If we could turn the lights off, all of them. This is a video from Father's Day, 2014. The sound is a little strange, I'm told, but it's the best we've got. Bear with it, and it gets a little better.
Dad taught us many important values. He taught us honesty, being true to your word, thriftiness, and the confidence in knowing that we could figure out the answers to most of life's problems. I'd like to share my background a little of what I remember about growing up in our household. My sister, my two brothers, and I were blessed with having been raised in a stable home environment. I grew up in Naperville, Illinois, where I lived until I went to college. At the time, Naperville was similar to what Corvallis was like about 20 years ago. Both were college towns with populations of 20 to 30,000 people, surrounded by farmland, and at least in my memories, our life was fairly idyllic. If you're old enough to remember the TV series Father Knows Best, then you have an idea of what I think our family was like. When I was growing up, our family attended the First Congregational Church in Naperville. With few exceptions, we attended church every Sunday. If there was dissension in the family ranks about why we had to go to church again, my parents, especially Dad, would tell us to, quote, just get in the car because we're going to church, end of discussion. And I will admit to you that if either of my two sons were giving this talk this morning, they would tell you I've used the same clever strategy. One summer day, my younger brother and I figured out we could make some money selling dirt. So we got some small brown paper bags from my mom, filled them with dirt from the garden. We set up a stand in our front yard, it was probably in our wagon, and had the bags priced at either a nickel or a dime each. Now we had some people slow down to see what we were doing, but by the end of the day we hadn't sold even one bag. When Dad got home, I imagine he must have had to suppress a smile because he said that the dirt was probably too valuable as garden soil to be selling. I used to get down on the floor and help my kids construct forts, play wrestle and tickle with them. We used to play sock wars where we'd throw the clean laundry at each other. And we taught them to be comfortable outdoors and in general around the outside. As they grew older, I also became a scoutmaster for Troop 1, and that was very enjoyable. When I was younger, my dad helped me learn how to navigate through life. When last fall, Dad decided that it was time to give up his car. Now I'm the one that's driving him to church, and I'm starting to help with his finances. It seems as though things have come a full circle. Thank you for listening this morning.
Good afternoon. My name is Greg Christianson. I'm Greg's youngest son. On my dad's 64th birthday, back in March, I decided to write him a letter to share 64 of my fondest memories of him as we've shared as father and son. Today, I'd like to read a portion of that letter to you. Dear Dad, July 17th, 2017 will represent the day that I will be exactly one half of your age. And as I see it, if I could be one half of the dad, mentor, and best friend you are to me, I will have met my goal in life. Here are a few of my fondest memories from the past 32 years we have spent together. Number 1, as a young boy, I remember clinging to your back as we snorkeled through the crystal clear Caribbean island off of St. John. You showed me all the turtles, fish, and a world beneath the surface, all from the safety of your shoulders. Number 4, my first job, which was working for Greg Christianson Construction, when I discovered what a day of real work was actually about. My first day was spent installing a sump pump under a low-slung house. We cut the floor out of a bedroom to access the problem, dug out a sump in the mud, one shovelful at a time. Number 7, making our pine wood derby cars in the basement of the house for Cub Scouts. You always insisted that Carl and I design and build our own cars. Whereas other dads may have made their kids' cars for them, it was on us to make a good racer, and you always respected that this was something we had to own, like so many other things growing up. Number 11, all of those afternoons and weekends in high school, running the sickle bar mower through the blackberry thickets and pulling them out one by one. The resulting habitat, flanked by the new ponds, was in many ways what I consider to be your masterpiece, and I was there to help with it. Number 18, teaching us how to plant a tree, or 300 Douglas fir trees around the property in one weekend. I've come to appreciate that long weekend of work, as it really taught me that things don't always come right away, and sometimes you have to wait for the forest to appear. Number 21, getting switched with Carl to sit next to you for a little extra attention to learn proper dining etiquette around the family dinner table. Number 27, carefully building the flower garden in the front of the house for Mom. She was absolutely thrilled to have finally got to receive the garden of her dreams. Number 30, having your expert eyes look at our first home before we bought it. Getting the Greg Christianson stamp of approval made me very proud, as I consider you to be the ultimate craftsman. Number 36, teaching me how to throw a baseball, whilst learning I needed glasses along the way. I can recall many summer nights throwing a baseball or softball with you in the side yard and going to cheer you on out in the softball field with the church's Holy Sox softball team. Number 51, seeing the truly special relationship you have always had with your siblings. Every trip to see their respective family around the West was such a highly anticipated event for us. In my youth, I would be torn up as we'd had to leave, and it was all attributed to the special relationships that you and Mom nurtured despite the geographic distance. Number 56, hearing you recount story after story on long road trips. Carl and I would always ask you to tell us a story to pass the time, and you always seem to have an endless supply of crazy, adventurous, sometimes scary, but equally entertaining tales of your younger years. Number 60, learning the crucial importance of debt by the way of monthly pain of writing a check to pay down my $1,000 car loan for my first car to you and Mom, including interest. Number 63, showing me what it means to be a devoted spouse by the relationship you have shared with Mom over the 40 years of your life together. The love and support you have shown her as she battled valiantly against the challenges of MS and its complications have truly been an inspiration to me and those of us around. And finally, number 64, Vancouver Island, your favorite spot on earth. I could easily write 64 memories on this very topic alone, but my favorite one is the one that got away. What must have been a 200-pound halibut you and I... What must have been a 200-pound halibut that you and I fought for several hours outside of Quatsino Sound. Our mightiest attempts to make progress against that fish, gaining 15 feet at a time, were quickly taken back as that massive fish refused to surface. I often think on that day now, you and I, in it together, as the seas grew lumpy and our tasks grew harder. Despite our most courageous effort, it was a fight we just couldn't win. And in the end, Dad, you said it was okay to let go. I will love you forever, Dad. Sincerely, your youngest son, Scott.
Wanted this afternoon to go to how he wanted his life to be witnessed to. One of the things he wrote was an obituary, which I will admit I was a little disappointed not to see printed in the Gazette-Times. The obituary he wrote for himself reads, "Thank you for my rich life. I mean it in every way. I got a lot of long straws." And knowing Greg, I believe with my whole heart, he meant that. He was mostly grateful for what he had been given and for what he and Rose created. And he was, of course, also disappointed that there were things he would not see, places he would not return to, long straws that would remain undrawn. And we, primarily though Rose and Carl and Scott and their partners, their children, and Gary and Linda and Wayne, and also the many, many of us who Greg welcomed into his wide net of friendship, we get to keep the gifts he gave us. Mostly, of course, we would rather just keep him. We want him to cast that line and reel that salmon in one more time, to play another inning with the Holy Sox, to make sure everybody at the party has a drink in their hand and is engaged and comfortable. We want to hear his voice in the choir, see his eyes light up and catch ours with a smile and a twinkle from across the room. We want his support of our project, his verbal and nonverbal affirmations of who we are and what we're doing, his ineffable kindness, his guidance, his care, his love, his encouragement, his laugh, and his wide open heart. We want him to be at dinner tonight, at breakfast tomorrow. We want him for Christmas, for birthdays, for graduations, for weddings. But we don't get those things. We get to keep the gifts he gave us. And I think what Greg gave was the fullness of himself. We got a man who was brave and generous enough to live in the core of his self and to invite us to do the same. My experience of Greg was as one of those rare people who looks into your eyes and really sees you, who listens deeply without thinking about what he's going to say next or how he's going to match your story with his own, unless maybe it was a joke, whose eyes light up when he sees you coming. When I encounter these kinds of people, which is an unfortunately infrequent experience, I know this is a person who is living in the fullness of their spirit, their soul, the seat of themselves. Some folks attach religious language to it. It is, after all, the spiritual journey to become who we are. Other folks don't use religious terminology. They just are. They may go to church, but their sanctuary might more closely resemble the pond or the slough where the birds are, or Vancouver Island, the lake, the woods, the ocean, the field where they walk the dog. And these were Greg's sanctuaries, his places of encounter with the Spirit. I suspect that if I had been given the time, the gift of more time with Greg, he would have taught me a thing or two about the spiritual life. We get to keep the gifts he gave us. The fullness of himself and the invitation to embody our own selves just as fully and just as joyfully. His gift is also this: whoever you are, and whatever you're doing or not doing, however your experience with your spiritual self is something you articulate or something you're silent about, that is your gift. And you are giving it to us, just as Greg gave himself to us. Could we do it better? With more kindness or more gentleness, more humor? Probably. I know I could. But that's beyond the point. Because we're doing it good enough, friends. Being who you are gives me permission to be myself. Our hearts are worth something, and we ourselves, in our deepest and truest nature, are of value. And that is the gift. We, gathered here, are more ourselves for Greg's love. The last time I held a coherent conversation with Greg, he told me to go be with Peter and Moses, my husband and my son. Go home to them. Go love them, he said. And it reminded me of a poem Mary Oliver wrote about the Buddha. It's called The Buddha's Last Instruction. Make of yourself a light, said the Buddha before he died. I think of this every morning as the east begins to tear off its many clouds of darkness, to send up the first signal. A white fan streaked with pink and violet, even green. An old man, he lay down between two sala trees, and he might have said anything, knowing it was his final hour. The light burns upward, it thickens and settles over the fields. Around him, the villagers gather and stretch to listen. Even before the sun itself hangs disattached in the blue air, I am touched everywhere by its ocean of yellow waves. No doubt, he thought of everything that had happened in his life. And then I feel the sun itself as it blazes over the hills, like a million flowers on fire. Clearly, I'm not needed. Yet I feel myself turning into something of inexplicable value. He could have said anything. He knew what was in front of him. And he told me to go love my people and be loved by them, which is the best and most concretely spiritual advice anyone has ever given me on how to live a life.
long time. I'm one of a whole lot of you whose house is blessed by having been worked on it by Greg and his teams. I had the unfortunate privilege of being there with Greg and Rose when they received the diagnosis in the emergency room 8 months ago, and was there at the end of his life. It's been a difficult road, but Greg did it with such grace, and he allowed people in, and his biggest concern, his biggest fear when I asked him was that Rose would be all right. He was not worried about himself, but about Rose. And I can tell by this room and by this family that she will be fine. He has done well in preparing us to take care of her as well as we can. And she's allowing people to care for her, and that's a gift. It's been my privilege to be able to pray with them through this time as well, and so I would like to pray again with all of you. Let us be together in prayer. Creator and sustainer, our oldest stories tell us that you have breathed us into being and that we must each return to you and to this holy earth in our own time. Grant us peace and the steadfast assurance of your presence as we remember all of those who have gone before us. Help us to see life whole and restored, to recall the stories and promises of our faith that death is not the end of life, but a mysterious beginning. As Greg was with you even while he lived with us, so we know that he is with us even as we return him to you. We give you thanks for the good gift of life itself, the stunning beauty of this earth, its forests, its mountains, and its waters, for the unique beauty of Oregon's diverse landscapes, which Greg loved, and the many places in this world that he loved, for strong and amazing bodies that allow us to hunt and fish and hike and be together, and for medical care that enable us to keep going even when our bodies are failing us, for the unique grace of family and friendships, the gift of moments that sustain us through all that life brings us. We praise you for the strength you have given Rose in particular through these difficult last months, as the brain tumor and the steroids stole Greg from her. We praise you for your constant loving kindness and your strong arms that guide and uphold us. We give you thanks for Greg Christianson, your beloved one. Into the palms of your outstretched hands we commit him to your keeping, trusting your mercy and your wisdom. We thank you for making yourself known to us through him, in his love for and loyalty to his family, in his graceful, caring nature that made him show up for others when they needed him, in his remarkable smile that shone through even his hardest days, for his commitment to doing a job right and pitching in to help others do a good job, for his patience in teaching scouts and students of all ages, for his appreciation of the smallest things, the birds, the pond, the embrace. We give thanks for all that we remember now in silence. For every memory of love and joy, every memory of life well lived, and every sorrow shared with us, we give thanks. Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer. Gracious and generous God, we give you thanks for the hope that we know through the testament of the gospel, for the love you showed in the life of Jesus and in his death and resurrection. Because of this love, we know that death is not the final word. Oh God, you know the secrets of our hearts. You alone hold what is hard to hold within. You bear our pain. You bear our anger. You bear our tears and our loneliness. You bear the questions that have no answers. Comfort us in our grief. Come close even if we do not call to you by name. And in the darkest places, give us hope. God of all consolation, you pursue us with untiring love and dispel the shadow of death with the bright dawn of life. Look in mercy on those who mourn at this time, especially Greg's family, who have loved him and were with him through his final days. For Rose, for Scott, for Carl, for Wayne and Gary and Linda, and all of the extended family. Holy One, bear them and strengthen them. Wipe every tear and still their fears. As they leave this place, may the Spirit surround them and go before them until they glimpse the light that always shines beyond the places we can see. Amen.
Who weaves all things together. We give thanks for Greg and all the good gifts we've shared. For the rising of the sun, the phases of the moon, the earth that keeps turning, O giver of all good things, we give thanks. 1,000 thanks. Amen.